Hey friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
Hello again, friends. Blair Hicks, your host of the Forward Rewind podcast. You are tuning into another week, and it's going to be a good one because we've got Pastor Daryl here and Pastor Derek. Say hello.
Hello, hello. Hello.
I mean, my very first question, we're diving in. What did you ask for Christmas? Or you may pick between one of these two. Ooh. Or what do you recommend people ask for Christmas? Ooh. Threw in a twist there. We heard some of yours, Derek, and you weren't secret about it. You were like, buy the Apple tags. Pretty much that's what you said.
I did say buy Apple tags. If you're like me,
okay,
I'm gonna put a caveat on there.
Okay.
If I had Apple tags throughout my whole life,
yeah.
Despite the fact that they currently run about $40 a tag, I would have saved hundreds of dollars and so much stress and headache and time.
Hundreds of dollars, like on losing things,
losing wallets,
wallets and keys in particular.
Okay,
right. So I am I'm a notorious at like not remembering where I put my keys or my wallet down, and just the amount of time I've wandered places looking for those things. Then the amount of time that takes if you lose a wallet to go replace all the things in your wallet. Yeah.
I feel like I would get that for my husband Steve. He plays a game I like to call the blame game. So if he loses his keys, he'll say, Where'd you put my keys?
Yeah.
Or his wallet, like, where'd you move my wallet?
So I may also be notorious at doing those things.
What is with that? It's hilarious.
Look, I'm like, I couldn't possibly have misplaced my keys, even though I've misplaced them a million times before.
I'm like, yes, Steve, I took your truck keys and took it for a stroll. We went driving around the corner, and then I threw them at the window.
I think there's going to be a lot of people who relate to this conversation right now.
I don't recommend sarcasm in your marriage, P.S. Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
The Apple tags I find interesting because I had this idea years ago, and I would love for someone to steal this and just make it. Shark Tank idea.
Okay.
So like the Apple tags, or there's like Tile as well. Like I just want something like for our kids where you can just like put this tag like in the shoe or something.
Right.
And then if you're at like a theme park or somewhere and they run, you just set it like, I'll give them like a 20-foot radius.
Yeah.
So if they run away and that goes too far, then your phone will tell you like which direction did they go.
That's pretty good.
That would work. No, but it would work. It would work with an Apple tag.
Would it work for that?
Yeah, because it uses any Apple products that anybody is carrying within the area to triangulate the position,
and it'll tell you which direction.
Yeah,
but I want it to like have an alarm where it's like, oh, they're too far.
They're outside the range.
Yeah, outside the range.
It does tell me if I've left a place and the
Forgot
thing
something.
that the tag is in is no longer with me.
Yeah.
So I've gone to leave home before, and it's like, your wallet is still at, and then it gives my address.
Burger King, Derek.
Right? There you go.
That's on my.
Yeah. And yet again, I just want to point this out for our listeners. Yet again, I dreamt of an idea, and then, years later, Steve Jobs, Apple comes in.
You take the credit for all of the Apple credit.
No credit. I'm just really happy that technology catches up with my dreams.
I'll give you one other good Apple tag for our listeners. One other good Apple tag use. I put it in my luggage recently when I traveled.
Okay.
And so then I knew that my luggage had actually made it to the destination.
Yes.
I wasn't left hanging around waiting to see if one more piece of luggage would come down. I knew as soon as I got off, okay, the luggage is here in Toronto.
Okay.
I don't have to worry about whether it's going to show up.
That is a great travel hack. I thought of that the last time I traveled. That would be really helpful, just with all the chaos in the airports recently. Yeah.
Now, I did hear a thing in regards to the tags and putting them on your kids. It's a gray area because people can also hack and connect to your tags.
Well, they
Dun,
might,
dun, dun.
they can, they might be
Yeah.
able to use it to track where your kid is.
Because I
Yeah.
may or may not have investigated those things for my own kids.
You can buy dog collars that have them on there too, in case you have a pet that's prone to running away.
Yeah.
You know,
like you just want to be safe, like
Yep.
in busy areas,
Yeah.
just to help you out. But
Yeah.
yes, the
Yeah.
the nefarious side of it is definitely the
So
downside.
Daryl, what do you want for Christmas? We got to get
Yeah.
to this.
Oh, what I want for Christmas, I want a keyboard. That's a mechanical keyboard. That's really,
it's like a gaming
it's like,
keyboard.
it's like really clicky. I want the tactile clicky.
Is that for gaming?
clickiness. Well, just anything. I just like the tactile clickiness of it. Here's the thing. Like
My son has a mechanic. Luke has a
I
mechanical
get
keyboard.
super nuanced on like the
Okay.
things that I love. Like I love like the tactile feel of like certain like this notebook. Like I really like this style of notebook or like this style of like keyboard or just those things I love to nerd out on. So
Do you have
typically
a-
whenever it's a Christmas, a gift thing,
Right.
that's usually when I just think of like what are those things I just love to kind of nerd out on. Yeah.
Do you have a typewriter?
I do have a typewriter.
I pegged you for a typewriter owning
It's in my office.
individual. Oh, is it?
Yeah. It's in my office.
I'm writing
Could you
my sermon on
wait
it.
a second. Could you say that one more time? What did you ask him?
Do you have a typewriter?
A typewriter?
Yeah.
A typewriter. Did you catch that?
A typewriter. A typewriter.
Yes, a typewriter.
What
but
did I
am
say?
fairly certain that multiple times you said a typewriter.
I did
It's
hear
recorded.
typewriter.
It's recorded, so we can go back.
I know we can.
Listeners,
and I'm
pause.
counting,
Typewriter.
on the fact that our listeners will go back.
Well, the thing
and
is,
confirm
Derek-
that Blair pronounces it typewriter.
The thing is, Derek, when typewriters were high in use, I was very young and infantile in my younger years. So I know you're older
right.
than me. So.
Whenever someone mispronounced something, my follow-up question is always, can you say the word penguin?
Well, I know what I'm gonna.
There's a lot of overlap of
Yeah.
if you can't pronounce.
I feel like we could probably take the podcast in the direction of Android versus Apple, because I'm sure many of our Android listeners are going, but what's the equivalent of an Apple tag to my Android? But we won't
they're
go
not
there.
as good.
Oh, okay.
Tile.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm putting a stop to that conversation because I know you'll both take off with it. If anybody cares, I'm going to ask for a scarf like this because the truth be told, I wore white today and Billy hates it when I wear white on
Yeah.
podcast day. So I borrowed this from Jen Pent and it is gloriously warm and fuzzy. So Steve,
Yeah, note to Steve.
Derek, Daryl, Billy.
Note to Steve.
Oh, guess I'm not getting a work present. But this podcast is a particularly special podcast because we are wrapping up our Acts series.
Yep.
Whoop, whoop.
It's been a whirlwind, eh? 10 weeks and we're through.
10 weeks. How's your headache from last week, Daryl?
It's much better.
Is it was it from the Acts series maybe?
Maybe not. Maybe from the weather.
Okay.
Lasted for a few days, but
dear.
I'm okay now.
I'm going to blame the Acts series on it.
Maybe.
10 weeks is just short time to
is,
do
yeah.
Acts, but we are here in our last week, and the name of this week was Share Your Story, Share God's Heart, and we were in Acts 26. So let's start with Derek. Give us a brief overview of your message and the main takeaways.
Yeah, we just I focused in on what could we learn from Paul's presentation of the gospel to Festus and Agrippa and Bernice, and how might we take some of those lessons and apply them in our own lives.
Mm-hmm. You had very poignant points.
Poignant
They
points.
were, I don't even know if but they were 4 very clear points, and we're going to
4
cover
points,
them.
Yeah.
Daryl, you had a bit of a different approach, so give us an overview.
Yeah. So just kind of want to give an overview of really trying to sum up the series of Acts as well, is that this is really a series about what it means to be a disciple. And so just walk through the fact that every disciple has a story to share. And Paul is really making this clear in just him explaining how he came to faith, where he was at, and where God has led him. And then also explaining how every disciple has this mission that God has given to us. So I really feel like these are these non-negotiable aspects of what it means to be a disciple. You need to see how God has shown up in your life, and you need to see how you're involved in his mission. And just kind of summed it up with this idea of God's heart, of just understanding, like, if you are a follower of God, like, you should be concerned, you should desire to be in line with God's heart for the world. And again, these are not negotiable things for us as disciples.
I'd love to hear if there was anything that stood out to you during your message or during your prep and study this week, specifically in Acts 26. Like that's where we were in this sermon. Was there anything that jumped out at you? And since neither of you are jumping in,
my bookmark's in the wrong spot. I gotta get there.
let me broaden it, okay? Or what impacted you most from this message or even the series?
I mean, what verse that I didn't even get to the last verse.
Okay.
In the chapter, but
Okay.
The last verse, verse 32, Agrippa turns to Festus after hearing Paul give his story and said, "This man could have been released if he had not appealed to Caesar."
Oh.
Because Agrippa's basically saying, hey, there's nothing really here. Like he should not even be in custody. He
Right.
should be set free. But now he's appealed to Caesar, so you got to kind of send him to Caesar. You know, we think, oh man, what a kind of a bummer, right?
Yeah.
But it's really an answer to a prayer that Paul has been praying for years, which is that he would get to go to Rome. And now he's going to go to Rome. But it's interesting how oftentimes our prayers are answered in ways that are completely unexpected to us.
Yeah.
So I didn't even really wasn't looking at that part of it. But God had placed a burden on Paul's heart to get to Rome. And he's going to take him there, but probably not in the way that you or I or Paul would have imagined or maybe wanted to get there, right?
Which was what kind of would take us back to your first point, Derek, which was obedience and availability matter more than a plan. That might not have been the Paul plan way of getting to Rome, but he...
Yeah, and yet I think you see in this a little bit that like God often does put a plan in our hearts.
Sure.
But we don't get all the details of it, right?
Or even a say in the execution.
Right. And
Sure.
What really matters is walking in obedience to God if we're going to see God move in that.
And that can change the way we pray for and about that stuff, right? To put our hearts in a posture that is obedient and available rather than just praying a specific plan.
Yeah. God, here's my plan, bless it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Was there anything that jumped out at you, either in this sermon prep, Daryl, or in the series? Either one you want to.
Sure. Yeah. The thing that always jumps out to me, I think there's like some really great lines in chapter 26. I went over it pretty quickly on Sunday, but where Festus in verse 24 says, "Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning has driven you out of your mind." And Paul says, "I'm not out of my mind." Most excellent, Festus. I just love that moment of just seeing these men. I mean, obviously they're well educated, they're powerful, and like they're grappling and wrestling through like what Paul is sharing with them. And so he kind of responds like, "You're out of your mind." And then King Agrippa is like, "Are you like trying to like convert me right now?" So, this was like a court hearing. I didn't know what was going to happen. And I just love Paul was so bold in his presentation of the gospel. And I talked a lot about this on Sunday. Like he was not out trying to save his own skin. Like he wasn't backpedaling. Agrippa just says, "Hey, you give us your best defense." And his best defense is, here's why Jesus is who he says he is. And I just love that boldness that he had, even to the point that, I mean, like so often I feel like we try to not cause offense. We try to be, nice, well-adjusted Christians. And Paul just wasn't that way. He definitely made some people upset in his life. And if we're trying to emulate what he did, we need to be less concerned about, I guess, always being, super nice to everyone.
Yeah. Well, it's an example. That scene is kind of an example of knowing that when you are bold, there will be the people going, "He's lost his mind. He's crazy."
It's interesting too, because when Festus makes that remark to Paul and Paul responds back, he says, "Hey, I'm speaking words of truth here." And he does this little great apologetic shift. He turns and he says, "Hey, the king knows about this stuff. He knows about these matters, so I can speak boldly to him." He says, "For I am convinced that none of these things has escaped his notice, since this was not done in a corner." And the point Paul is making here is like, once again, this is rooted in history. There are witnesses to the realities of what I'm speaking about. This is not some metaphysical thing. I'm talking about a moment that's happened that had all sorts of people witness it.
Right.
And if you think that I'm just crazy, let's talk to the king, because he's around. He's a Jew, and he was around Jerusalem when all this stuff was going on.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like Paul he doesn't like just make hot takes, and I think that we live in a culture of just kind of hot takes where you can kind of just like say anything. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in the truth. But Paul, like he roots things in the truth. Like he's like, this is historical. This is factual. You were there. Like you might think I'm out of my mind, but I'm like reasoning this out for you.
Yeah.
And it's not just a hot take. And so he isn't just out there to rustle those feathers, though he's not afraid to. But I think a lot of that's that heart and that perspective that he brings to it.
Well, and Agrippa, doesn't he at one point say, he says a rhetorical question to, Paul says a rhetorical question to Agrippa about, don't you believe?
Yeah, he says, don't you believe the prophets? I know you do. He doesn't even give him a chance to answer, right? He's like, because you're Jewish, you believe the prophets. And like I said on Sunday, he's really a leading question.
Yeah.
Because he's trying to lead Agrippa into this. Well, if you believe the prophets, why don't you believe in the one the prophets were prophesying about?
Yeah, and now, correct me.
And that's when Agrippa says, in such a short time, Paul, would you make me a Christian?
Right. And aren't there some translations that use the word like persuade?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we could talk about this for a minute about like the word persuade. Like you'd almost kind of expect Paul to get apologetic. Or I'm sorry, go into like the apologetics.
And I think he is. I think he is. He's doing two things. One, he's speaking to a Jew, so he's trying to get him to the prophets, to this shared understanding of truth, right?
Yeah.
Say, hey, if you believe the prophets, let's talk about what the prophets have to say. And isn't Jesus a fulfillment of those prophecies? We could take a look at that.
Yeah.
But he's also saying, hey, this is a historical event, and I think this is so important for us always as Christians, right? Yeah. This is written as if Jesus really did die.
Yeah.
And he really did rise from the dead.
Yeah.
If that didn't happen as a historical event, let's just close up shop.
Yeah.
But because Paul's whole argument in multiple spots, not just here, but when we get into his epistles, is that this is a real reality that took place.
Yeah.
This is where our hope lies. It lies not in some idea, but in an actual moment and person in history. And
then he tells his story.
Yeah.
Which I love that we kind of
Jesus' story interacts with his real story.
Yeah.
Right?
So, and what I kind of took away of maybe a little bit on your message, Daryl, was like talking about, being able to tell your story. And that is, we don't have to necessarily get apologetic, we can just tell our story, right?
Yeah.
And you made a comparison actually to Paul's story, which Derek, you said he connected Jesus' story to Paul's story. Yep. But then you talked about Timothy's story and kind of compared the two. And why are they both good representatives of our differing stories too?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to know our story to see how God has worked in our lives. As we think of our evangelistic tool belts, like what are the different ways that we can share the gospel? The most powerful and hopefully the most obvious tool that we have is just our story, how God has worked both in leading us to Christ and also how God's been working in our life recently. And just being aware of that. I mean, like yesterday, I went to like at least five different convenience stores looking for Tylenol for my son Parker. He's 3. And it was just this heartbreaking, like every shelf was just empty, just like nothing. And so I get home, like, all right, we have like one more little shot of what we have, and then that's it. And I'm like, oh, what are we going to do? And then we looked, and then my wife looked in the cupboard one more time, and she found like a full bottle of Tylenol.
That's like liquid gold.
Yeah,
that is.
Which I'm like, if there's any parent out there who's like really struggling, just let us know. We got some.
Okay.
Okay.
See the Siemens family.
Yeah. All right. We can help at least one, maybe 2 other people. But then just connecting that, and it only came up this morning. We were praying. I was sharing the story, and I think Billy pointed out, he's like, "Wow, God really provided." I'm like, right. Yes, God, provide. Yeah, let's like draw the lines here. Let's see. Like, okay, we're praying. Like, okay, it's like, this is a need. We need medicine. Okay, like you need to see God showing up and just having those eyes, being aware of it.
Yeah.
That is something that we can use now to share and talk with others. Like, hey, here's how God has shown up, or here's how he is hopefully like the salvation story that we have that we can share. And I just point out, like, some of us, it's going to be dramatic. It's going to be huge, like the life of Paul. For others, it might be less dramatic, like the life of Timothy. And we don't know a whole lot about Timothy, but in Paul's second letter to Timothy, in the first chapter, he says, "Say, Timothy, like you grew up in a house full of faith. From your grandmother to your mother to you, this has been your story." That's a far cry from what Paul shares here, where he murdered Christians.
Yeah, it is.
Those are two very different stories. There might be other baggage that Timothy had. I don't want to read too much into it, but I think Paul is just showing him, like, hey, like, here's how God has been leading you up until this point, the faith within your family. And so for some listeners, I mean, I think it's important to say, like, you don't need to have that dramatic story. I think sometimes in the church, we kind of platform, we talk about those who have those really big stories, maybe too often. It's good to hear from just really simple salvation stories. That is really good to hear as well. And so as much as we can, like, we need to hear from both sides of how God's been working.
Yeah, it's like kind of I called it like a progressive transformation and realization kind of story versus like this dramatic, sudden, impactful change in the middle of someone's life, right?
Yeah,
Like,
and both are good, and both you can see God working in your life.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is a story of just dramatic. Other times it takes months or years up until that point where someone gives their life fully to Christ.
Yeah. What an encouragement, though, to know that your story can still impact and can be used to tell people about Jesus. Speaking of stories, this is awesome because this is the question I've been really excited to ask. What stories have you heard from people or through people that have been impacted by this series and learning about Acts? Maybe some stories you can share about people telling their stories or sharing their faith and love for Jesus with others. Do you have any stories you can share that you've heard from the congregation or from other people throughout this series?
Just this week, I had one of our senior saints come up to me and share with me that a few weeks back I had been talking about sharing your faith with people, even people who seem really unlikely people for the gospel. And she said, I had this person move into my apartment building and, rough around the edges, cursing all the time. And but I remembered what you said, and I invited her over for coffee, and we got into a conversation, and I've got to share the gospel with her. We're going to get together again. And I just
Cool.
Somebody who's been following Jesus for many, many years, faithful follower of Jesus, could easily say, hey, you know what? Like, I'm just going to coast. I've kind of done my bet. And yet she's on fire and looking for opportunities to share her faith, talking to a couple other people who have been sharing their faith with people at work. One who has now had their coworker come with them to church for the last few weeks and is really engaging with stuff. Another one who said to him, hey, like, it's kind of too late for me. There's too much stuff in my history.
Wow.
And this person was like, let me share the gospel. That's just not the way that this works. And he invited him to come out. He wasn't able to come out that week, but he watched online. And the week that he watched online was the week where we were, where I was preaching on the fact that the gospel is for everyone.
Cool.
And it spoke directly to that reality that there's no amount of what's in your past history that would disqualify you from coming to Jesus. And he said that he watched that and he wanted to come the next week. It's just, I've heard all sorts of stories like those where I'm just excited about how God is moving, giving people boldness and giving people opportunity to step out and share Jesus with other people.
I love that. Do you have any stories, Daryl? I think we should just have a whole podcast on stories. Let's just go with this.
Yeah, some cool stories. I know one guy, he shared with me, he's like, hey, Daryl, this week, just to want to let you know, I've invited some people out to church. And he's like, I often do this, but this week, everyone I invited said yes. So I'm going to have like 20 guests with us today. And,
Right on.
and I just love that. I'm like, that's so cool. And to someone who, I think sometimes we think of people who are like really good at evangelizing, like they're just like life of the party. And I won't say this guy's name, but he's not like in your face, life of the party.
Yeah.
Super nice guy though. And he just, in his own way, just invites people like, hey, would you like to come to church? And like, you can just have like, you don't have to have like that super outgoing personality. You can just be like a normal dude and just invite people. So that was awesome. I think it was a few weeks later. I think it was the same guy who said, hey, I have someone coming and they're not a believer. I'm wondering what are you preaching on? Like, will they feel at home here? And it was a message that was all about like, we are a church that, you know, is inclusive. Like we want anyone to come on in. Like we're not going to like bar the doors and say, no, you don't quite believe the same thing as us. Like you have to stay out. Like we're going to challenge you. We're going to leave you to Jesus, but like everyone is welcome here. And I'm like, man, I'm just so excited that we are able to hit on these really crucial points throughout this series. And then finally, just a lot of stories over the past little while, as many of our listeners would know, in Kitchener, we've been exploring just because of our lease at the Edelweiss was coming to an end December, looking through, okay, are we going to stay here? Are we going to look at a different location for us? And so that was a big, long process, and seems like God has answered that of us staying at the current location. But it has been good just to wrestle through with some people of this. I think the conversation came up time and time again of, I would really like to be more comfortable, but I know that God's mission is bigger than that. Just time and time again. And I feel that I'm like, I want life to be easy, and I don't really want to set up every morning. I know a few weeks ago I said I like setting up chairs, man. I mean, if I could choose between, you know, just sitting back drinking coffee, I'm sure I'll just choose that one.
I did thoroughly go in depth with you on that. I was like, why, Daryl?
I like,
what is it about chairs?
I do like serving, but also at the same time, sitting back is nice too. Yeah. But I think this series has been really helpful for us as a church at just seeing why do we do the things that we do, and how can that help motivate us? And so now few conversations where I just say like, hey, like how does this fit into our mission as a church? And seeing people like, I don't have to explain that anymore. They just know exactly what that means when we talk about what our mission is as a church. So that's been, I think, really helpful for us.
I have one more from last week that I was going to put in my message and didn't get to share. It's a personal one. Okay. So I was at our national convention for our fellowship last week, and we were in Niagara Falls, and I was going for lunch with a couple individuals, taking them out for lunch, a couple pastors I know. We were going to go to Montana's, and Montana's was closed. So across the road is a Kelsey's.
Okay.
So we crossed the road to go over, sat down, started eating, had a little bit of chit chat with our waitress who was serving us. And she came back again near the end of the meal and said, hey, like, what are you guys in town for? And said, hey, well, we're here with a bunch of pastors for our denominational national convention. And she's like, oh yeah, like, tell me about that. Like, what do you believe? And so I said, well, like, what's your faith background? And she said, well, I grew up Catholic. You know, I haven't gone to church in quite a while, but I do believe that there's a God. She's like, how is your belief different than Catholic belief? And I said, well, I'm not going to get into what like the church actually believes, but let me share with you what I've discovered many Catholics think about their faith. They understand kind of that their faith with God is, their relationship with God is dependent upon doing a bunch of things to keep him happy. I said, I don't know if that's been your experience or not, but like you've got to get baptized, get confirmed. As long as you check the boxes, then you and God are in a good place. Right. I said, we actually believe that like there's an ongoing relationship with God, that I don't actually do things to please God, but God did everything that was necessary for me to have that relationship with him. So we just dialogue that quick. I got to pay a bill, right? And I know she's got some other tables. She's like, oh, that just really resonates with me. You know, like I'd really like to go check out a church that's like that. And so I was able to pass along a couple churches in the area, and she's like, I'm going to go check those out.
Cool.
I want to go learn more about this. I've just been thinking about it a lot recently in my life. There's some things that have been happening. And so, to the idea of like being available and obedient beats a plan.
Yeah.
I was not even planning to be at Kelsey's that day, but that was God's plan for us to end up at Kelsey's to have this conversation with this waitress, and praying for her in her journey now, that God would just use that moment to move her towards him.
I love that. Oh man, I want to keep telling stories. We'll just have story time. That's maybe we'll do a bonus podcast sometime of just stories, because I love that. We actually have a story group on our teams, staff teams, where an outlet for people to post some stories. So maybe I'll just read through those one podcast, because they're great. I don't know about the listeners, but it just gets me so excited. But I'm going to take us a little bit further here, because I'd like to know why you're both part of the series design team, correct? Like where the pastors, the teaching team will come together, and you guys will kind of hammer out the details of where you're going to go with this series. So I'd like to know why you took us through Acts, the route that you did, right? Focusing on the Holy Spirit, sharing Jesus, sharing our story. And what other topics or themes can be seen in Acts if we were to unpack it even further? Daryl, you said you had a pastor friend that did like 2 years.
Yeah, something like 2 years on Acts. Yeah.
So if we went back and read it,
that's called line by line preaching.
Oh my.
Line by line.
Whew.
There you go.
Sounds
We didn't even end in chapter 28.
No, we didn't.
26. Anyways, there you go.
But what if we went back and read it on our, like, what other things would we see?
Oh my goodness, Blair, you'd see so much stuff.
Yeah.
You'd see the realities of what it looks like when the family of God is functioning well and when it's not functioning that well.
Yeah.
You'd see stories of the gospel going out, but also the gospel being opposed. And we didn't spend a lot of time in a lot of the stories where, the gospel went into a place, caused transformation, but that also caused an opposition to rise up against it. And Paul gets chased out of town, or somebody gets chased out of town, or Stephen gets stoned, or right. Like there's martyrs in the book of Acts we didn't even cover.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, Acts 2.0. I'm sensing there's an Acts 2.0 in the near future.
I think you can see really the working of the Holy Spirit. I think you could see that as a theme all throughout the book of Acts. So much so that some have said it should be called, the Acts of the Holy Spirit, not necessarily the Acts of the early church. Acts is also where we see and learn a lot about the significance of baptism as well. There's several key moments of baptism as people choose, and that's kind of where we get a lot of our theology and understanding of baptism being confessional or believers baptism. That's an important aspect. So often whenever I sit down, talk with someone about baptism, like I'm right in Acts sharing some really key stories of how all of this happens. So that'll be an important theme to look through as well.
Well, there's my recommendation for future series.
Well, the reason we focused on Acts, and the reason we focused on the areas that we focused on, is that we do a spiritual health survey, which we just did again this fall. Our spiritual health survey from the fall before, one of the things that had come out and can continue to show up in this series is that in our mission of making disciples who love God, love others, and serve the world, we as a church struggle the most on this whole part of serving the world, especially in the area of sharing our faith with other people. And so if we're serious about making disciples who are fully orbed disciples, that's an area where we want to see us grow as a church. And we felt like this was a great spot to camp out, to put some focus on, to put some tools in people's toolboxes, and to challenge people to really step out of their comfort zone and share their faith.
And we've heard from these stories that clearly it was
God is definitely moving in some people's lives. And probably there's some of you who are listening who you're still struggling with that, and just want to continue to encourage you to grow in that area. It's an area that's difficult for all of us. I think I've shared multiple times, hey, it's not easy for me either. It's like, this is uncomfortable at times, and we don't like being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you actually kind of said at the beginning of your message, Derek, that you preach this stuff to yourself first while you're prepping. And it's worth mentioning too, like, we talked about doubt before. I think it was 2 weeks ago. We talked about doubt, and we've addressed the listeners that are still challenged, right, in this. So let's talk about this, about how we can hold our doubt and sin and struggle and our need for the gospel to be taught to ourselves, and take the opportunity to share the gospel with others in tension. How can we hold that in tension?
Well, first of all, I would like to extract or separate doubt and sin, because doubt is not sin.
No. But we can have doubt. You told us 2 weeks ago.
And you can have faith, and those, like,
It can
you
almost,
can have a strong faith and still struggle with, like, why, God?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or even like, I don't get how this works.
There's a healthy doubt, right?
Yeah.
But you know, taking that when you're sharing that could maybe be a barrier for some people to have doubt. And then you're saying,
because you feel like you need all the answers. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or like, but also, like, I agree. There needs to be a separation between, like, doubt and sin and struggle. But the reality is, we are imperfect.
Yep.
And I think that there isn't a subconscious effort in our brains to be like, well, I can't tell people about the gospel because I haven't figured it out myself yet. Or, you know, how do we hold those two in tension to be people who are sent, but also have our own sins and struggles, and separated from that, maybe even some doubts?
You want to take a stab at it, Daryl?
That wasn't.
Sure.
That was a hard question to communicate. I thank Andrew for the help for that, because he helped me with that question.
Well, Derek's picking apart some of your questions there makes it harder. Okay, so let me get my answer here. So I think that's an important thing to recognize. So I think what sometimes holds people back is, I gotta fix myself up. I gotta like fully like understand this before I can go and share my faith with others. Like, what if they notice that I'm imperfect, or I have deep struggles in sin as well? And I think that's a good clarification on doubt and sin. That doubt is, it's okay to have doubts and have struggles as well. But I think that in a lot of ways, this is the same question that people often ask before they give their life to Christ. It's, well, I got to fix myself up first. I need to get to a certain point, and then I'll start taking my faith really seriously. There's an old hymn called Come Ye Sinners, Poor and Needy. This really, really old hymn. It's actually one of my favorites because of just how powerful the words are in the song, where it points out in the song, it says that if you wait until you're perfect, then you'll never come to faith at all. So if you're just waiting for that moment where your life is perfect, where everything's all put together, then you will go and do these things. You're going to be waiting a whole long time until you are ready to do this. And in fact, it's actually in our own brokenness that these are parts of our story that God can use. I shared that on Sunday of how encouraging it's been in my life to hear from other believers of imperfect things in their lives, and still God was able to use them. So when I looked at my life, I'm like, yeah, I'm imperfect too. I struggle with the same things. And that's okay. And that can be really, really helpful in our journey towards Christ and the journey as a disciple of him. And so that'll be my encouragement to people is to not wait until you feel like you have it all perfectly figured out.
It would really be less helpful if you were that person who did have it all figured out, and you're bringing it to somebody who doesn't. They're not going to relate to
agree.
But
Sure.
a human is going to relate to a human. So a little bit better, right?
That's why there's like this whole joke like on The Simpsons of like Flanders being like this perfect Christian, and no one likes him because he tries to have himself as like too perfect, right?
How did The Simpsons end up in our podcast?
I can make a Simpsons.
You're searing Blair's conscience.
I can probably make a Simpsons reference every episode. So
I was not allowed to watch The Simpsons. I'm going to pray for your soul. There was one quote, Derek, that you brought up by Sam Albury. Jesus, tell me if I messed this up, but
I paraphrased them anyhow.
Oh, okay. Jesus is
my paraphrase.
Jesus is better at saving than you or I or anyone else is better at sinning.
Yeah.
Unpack this for us.
We to go to another old hymn.
Okay.
Grace, grace, God's grace, grace to pardon and cleanse within, right? Grace that is greater than all of our sin. Jesus' grace is bigger than all of the sinning that I can do. He's way better at saving than I am at sinning. So my sin will never outstrip his ability to save. And I just think that is the wonderful truth of the gospel, that I can't out-sin his ability to forgive me. It's not like I'm going to go to the cross one day and it's going to come up insufficient funds.
Right. I love that. You brought it up in terms of challenging us whether or not we actually believe that he can save, though. What was it? Well, it was your fourth point.
Well, yeah, Agrippa, like, do we really believe that the gospel is sufficient to save, right?
Yeah, and
like,
have confidence in it.
And have confidence in the gospel. Like, I can go and share the gospel with anyone and have confidence that the power of salvation is in the gospel. It's not in my presentation, which is a great relief that I don't have to have every answer. I don't have to know everything. I don't have to present it perfectly because the gospel is the power of salvation to all who believe. That's what Paul says in Romans, right? And it's the power of salvation to anyone who believes. I think it's so striking that Paul is making a gospel pitch to Agrippa, who is amongst the most unlikely people that you would ever think could ever become a Christian, given his current relationship dynamic and his past family history.
Yeah.
Like, there is nobody who kind of is more unlikely to be a Christian. And so when Agrippa says, Paul, would you persuade me in such a short time to be a Christian? And Paul's like, man, I just wish that everybody here, you, Bernice, Festus, the whole crowd that's come here, that you would all be just like I am, a follower of Jesus, except for the chains. Like, that's my wish for you, because I believe that life with Jesus is better than life without Jesus. And I want you to experience life with Jesus. And I think that the gospel is sufficient to save even somebody like Agrippa.
Yeah. And it's not even like outside the norms of history that God would save and redeem those who are in power and influence. I think that's just an interesting thing, that so often we actually do see that in history, and how God uses that to really shape the course and direction that history is going to take. So it's not really out of line for Paul to say, yeah, maybe God's done it before, he's going to do it again. Why not?
Well, he was that unlikely person
and
too.
Paul was the unlikely guy, so he's able to stand there and think, man, if he could save me, he can save you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of the verse that we were in a couple weeks ago about the soil. Somebody brought it up in their message, and the different types of soil that there is, that there are. Where is that found again?
It's a parable that Jesus tells in Matthew.
And how we kind of talked about how it's not our job to find that soil.
Yeah, we're not soil testers.
We're not soil testers. We're not even the
sowers.
tillers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a parent, that's another, like, you can be involved in the tilling, but that's another podcast. But it's not our job to be like, oh, you're way too, your soil is hard. Like, no, we're to throw the seed. Like, let's throw seed. So I love that. I want to give you guys a chance to tell us what one thing, you can talk to your listeners about whatever you want as we wrap up here, but also, what is one thing that you hope your church family and that the listeners will take away from this series? Or what's one thing that you want to leave them with at the end of this series?
I'll go, and then Daryl can wrap us all up.
Okay.
Sure.
I want us to be a people that actually believe the gospel is good news. that it's good news for us, that it transforms and changes us, because if we believe that it's good news, we'll take that good news out to the people that we love and care about, the world that's around us. Like when I said it was point 3 where I talked about that we actually have to believe that the gospel is good news for us before we're going to take it to anybody else. Like Paul elsewhere says it's the kindness of God that leads to repentance. Do we really believe that we have a good and gracious and kind God who loves us and cares for us? And if we believe those things are true, if we experience them in our life, I think it'll just flow out of us to other people, because you'll want people to have what you have. Just like Paul, he's like, man, I just know how good Jesus is in my life. So yeah, I want you, Festus. I want you, Agrippa. I want all of you to know Jesus like I know Jesus, because I just can't think of a better way of being and living. And I just pray that increasingly we would experience that as a church, and that the overflow of that would be that we are people who take that out to the world.
I love that. And even just, I know my prayer has been what you touched on last week, Derek, which was that our hearts would be driven by the same thing, that we would have hearts for other people to hear and to see that they need the same thing. We talked about that.
And we're going to be in a series just to encourage people. We're coming up to a series right now that I think if you've got people in your life, this is going to be a wonderful series to bring somebody out to help them see how good and gracious our God is, that it's in Jesus that we can find hope and joy and peace and love, those things that our hearts are just longing for.
You both brought up, I'm going to give you a sec to talk, Daryl, but you both brought up, I think it was 2 Timothy 2:4, or was it 1 Timothy 2:4, about where we got to see like the true heart of God, and also like his character, that he wants all people to know and to come. And you mentioned in your message, Daryl, that sometimes you think that we tend to see God as like an ultimate judge and exclusive, but here we get clarity on his heart. And we can line that up with him, with his help, and like pray, have that prayer, right, to the focus. But what do you want to leave your listeners with, the listeners with, or one thing that you hope that they'll take away from this series?
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to close with reading 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 4, where it says that God desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. For there is one God, and there is one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all, which is the testimony given at the proper time, and for which I was appointed as a preacher and as an apostle, a teacher to the Gentiles in faith and truth. And I just love this passage, and this is really my hope as we have studied Acts, as we go forward as a church, that we would be pursuing and after the heart of God. In everything that we do as a church, and as we live our lives as disciples of Christ, that we would desire to have the same heart as God. And this is so important. Just my encouragement to our listeners. I think that we spent the last few years really focusing in on ourselves. And that's why I've loved this series, is that it has forced us to start thinking about those in our community, those that we work with, those in our families, that need to have this relationship with Christ. That it is good. It is so essential. We don't do this because we just want people to fill our church, to fill the pews, but because we know that really that relationship with Christ is so essential. It's what ultimately gives us life, and to give life its fullest meaning is to be in relationship with him. And so that's my hope. That's my desire for us.
I love that. I learned my lesson, Daryl. Don't talk before the pastors talk, Blair.
Oh, no,
take their points right out of their mouth.
Just putting an exclamation mark on what you just said.
I love it. So that was 1 Timothy 2:4. I'd encourage listeners to go back and read that again. Pray it as well. What a great series. Acts Sent. Go back, listen to the messages on our website, but also the Rewind podcasts as well. I'm excited for our next coming up series. Follow the Star is the name of it, and that starts next week, which is crazy.
It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas around here, isn't it, Blair?
If you're not a Christmas person, Kirk, start getting into it because we are. So thank you for listening, and we will see you next week. One more point. If you are someone who has a story you want to share, email it to one of us, any of us. We absolutely love hearing stories about your story, or even just stories of you sharing the gospel with people around you. It excites us greatly. Have a really great week, everyone.